During this demonstration, we're going to show you how BlazeMeter can be used to test your applications, even when environments are not available that you may need for your application to run correctly. Everything you're going to see during this demonstration has been built on APIs. This means that you can drive BlazeMeter not just through the UI, perhaps from a COE, but also from IDEs and your CI/CD toolchain. So let's go straight to our demonstration. And we're using the digital bank application as our sample application. Now this application has APIs and a web interface that we need to test. It also has a dependency on a database and also third-party APIs. Now we're going to show how we can replace some of these third-party APIs with a mock service, and how we can also generate the test data we need to not only test these third-party APIs, but also test the application. So the first thing we need is an actual test. Now we could import your existing tests, but we're going to show you how we can generate a test using our recorder technology. So I've installed our Chrome plugin, as you can see up here. We've given the test a name, and I'm going to click record. Now we can label these scenarios. So we're going to say this first step is the login page. And we'll then go and log into our application. So pass our username and password. Now, as you can see on the right-hand side, in the recorder, we're capturing the UI and the performance side of the test. Now we're logged in, we're going to then say this is the home page. And perhaps we'll navigate to the checking account and check the checking account. Now here we can do things like do assertions. So I'm going to right click and we're going to do an assertion here to say, now is this text correct? And the next thing we're going to do is what we call an ATM search. We're going to use the ATM search function. So we go and click on the search button. And we're going to enter our zip code we want to search for. Now that will return a value. And again, we'll then use our assertion again here to assert that text is correct. And the last step we're going to have is a logout step. So we click on the logout and we log out. So we've now created a test. We can now stop our recorder. Now from the plugin, we could automatically load this test into BlazeMeter and run it. We could do many things with it. We're going to save the test to show you how we can generate the test. If I click on the save button, you can see we can save this as a JMX, as a Selenium, and also as a combined. I'm going to save those three to my machine, like so. So before we can run that test, what we need is to actually build the dependencies within our infrastructure that we need to actually support the application. And one of those is this ATM search API. And we're going to create a mock service. So we're going to use the wizard to build this mock service. We need to give it a name. We then need to build the request response pairs for the transactions within our mock service. Now we have a sample one here, but we're going to add a new one. And it's going to be our ATM search with 2 results. And the first thing we need is obviously the request side. So we have to set the method followed by the path. So when we get a request to this URL with a corresponding parameter, which is going to be zip equals, and then the string we use for our test. So when we see this request, we then need to set the corresponding response. So you can see here we can set the status code and also the body. So this is the body we're going to enter. And at the moment things are hard coded, but we'll change that just shortly. So there's our first transaction. Now if we delete the sample one, which is this one here, we now do next. The next step is to name the service and also where you want to deploy it to. So this could be in our cloud locations or on premise inside your own network. We click next. We can now start this mock service. So mock's now started. Here's the endpoint we need to configure our application for. And also we have an example of the URL. If we put this into a browser and run it, we'd get a response. So if I go to open my mock service, here's the mock service. You can see it's running. You can see our transaction we just created. And like I said, if I took that with that example response and we just paste it in the browser, we can see that that mock service is working. And we can also parameterize this. So we can then include our test data. So if we look at our example, if you remember, we use these hard-coded values. What we're going to do next is actually parameterize this and drive this with our test data. So we're going to edit the transaction. And as you can see here, we can do things like we can add some tags, we can add a description. When we look at the query parameter we created in the wizard, as you can see, it's a hard-coded value. We want to replace that with some test data. And on the right-hand side, we have our service data panel where we can create the rules we need to generate our test data. Now, I've already created a model, and I'm going to go and add that model to this test. So we're going to do add data entity. And in my BlazeMeter workspace, I already have some data entities to use, and here's my ATM location data. Now, what the data model contains is the rules we need to actually generate the data. So here's our rules. And you can see we're going to have cities and postcodes and states and zip codes. And this is the data we're going to use to drive our test. Now we can preview this data. We can go to the data settings. And we define how many rows of data we need. So at the moment it's set to 200. And what you're seeing here is all the data that we're generating. So everything here is synthetic. Now we have our city, we have our street, we have our zip code, our country, and all the other data we need for our test. Now I can choose to change this to say perhaps I want 100 rows instead of 200, and automatically that data will be generated. Now we can then take these parameters and parameterize our transaction. So I can take the zip code parameter, and when we've got a hard-coded value of 15001, we can replace that with a parameter. So we can now drive this test from our test data model. We also need to update our responses in the same way. So we're going to take our city and obviously replace the city. The same with the street and all the other parameters. So we parameterize the response, and then that will be updated based on the request. We can save that. We then update our data model, our mock service, and at this point, if we say yes, we'll regenerate the test data. So if you say no, it will keep the same test data, but we can now regenerate that test data as part of our mock service. And when that's completed in our data settings, we'll see that test data. Now, as you can see the test data, if we took this zip code 15222, before we had that static value, I can modify our test response here. And as you can see, we've got response back, 898 the Slade, and that corresponds to our test data. So all this test data is now valid on our mock service. We can also modify our mock service to respond in different ways. So we can change the think time. So perhaps we get a random delay to simulate an API that doesn't respond perfectly. And also what happens if there's no match. So we can forward this request onto a live system. So our mock service is running with our test data. We've configured our application to use that mock service. We can now go ahead and create our test. So we're going to come and create a performance test in the performance tab. We're going to upload the scripts that came from our recorder. And what we've got here is the Selenium script for a UI test, as well as a JMeter script for our performance test. Now, if we scroll down, we can now associate our mock service with this test. So we come and say we want to add a mock service. We select that mock service. And what you'll see on the right-hand side, we can now see the data model from that mock service in the performance test. So we can take this zip code that's in the data model for the mock service and use it in our performance test. So we're going to take the parameter here. And if we're going to look at our UI test, and we just scroll down, if you remember, we entered a hard-coded value. It's 15001. So if we scroll down to where we actually entered that into the recorder, it's just there. As you can see, we can replace this with that parameter. What we can also do is obviously update the assertion. So if you remember, we entered that 15001 and then we asserted on the value that came back. And if we scroll down, we'll see down here, that's the street that came back. So if we now go to our data model and we take the street and the same thing, we update that with the parameter. We've now updated our test with the zip code, and the assertion will be the corresponding street that came with that zip code. So we now have our test updated. We can then set the details for our load test. So how many users do we want to run our load test for? So let's say we're going to run 2,000 users. We want to run the test for 30 minutes. Now we can define things like ramp up time. So instead of just the load just starting all in one, we can define what the ramp up time is of our test. So we can ramp up over 5 minutes. So we're going to run for 30 minutes, and the first 5 minutes will be our ramping up time to get to 2,000 users. We can then define our load distribution. So you can see here we need 4 engines. So we can define where those engines will come from, as in which cloud provider, as also which physical location. So we could do everything from GCP and say we want to simulate some traffic from America, some traffic from London, and perhaps some traffic from Japan. So now we've defined where the load will come from, how many engines we need. We have our mock service defined. We can define our failure criteria. So we can look for what defines a successful test. Now we're going to say if the percentage error is greater than 20, this test will fail. And we can also define what we call the end user experience. So this is the Selenium test that we attached. And what this means is at runtime, what we'll do is we'll actually generate the load using the JMeter script, but we'll also then run these UI tests to understand how a UI experience would be when the system's under load. Now what we could also do on the right hand side is also add more test data. So if we wanted to include more test data than the data coming from our service model, from the mock service, we can just add it here and generate different data that perhaps this test needs. We could also integrate with APM systems, and this allows us to capture data from APM while we're under load. So while the system is under stress, as well as getting the end user experience, we can also get data from the underlying systems hosting the application to understand how the infrastructure is handling the load that we're generating. This test is now ready. We can schedule this test. We can call it from a CI/CD toolchain. We can just click Run Test. And what this will then do is initiate the test now. So this will actually provision those engines. As you can see here, it will download our code and it will then kick off our test. Now, we'll switch to the test that's now running. So we can see now how, with the blue line, we've actually added the load over the first few minutes of the test to get up to our 2,000 users. And then on the right hand side, we can see how the response time has responded to that load. So you can see the response time slowed down as the load has been generated. And along the top of the screen in the summary panel, we have the overview of the test itself. So what the maximum users is, our throughput, our error rate, response times, the locations where the load's coming from. We can drill into this test and actually look at the report as the test is running. And we can actually select individual URLs under test and look at things like response times and latency times for each of the individual components that we're testing. And also at the top of the screen, as you can see here, we can overlay our UI tests. So as you can see there's a little dot. That is the functional UI test that we ran. And as you can see, the response time was really bad. We can drill into that to look at the actual test that we ran. So we can see the response time. We can see the screenshots. So what the user actually see when they actually run this functional UI test. As well as the bottom of the screen, we can see the browser waterfall report. So which of the pages was loading particularly slowly, and we then mouse over those to look at more details about the actual response time for that particular page load. And like I said, this is in real time. So if we go back to the summary screen, this report is updating as the test progresses. Now we can share this report with other BlazeMeter users and also share it with external users. So we can share this with a public link, which would actually send you a link that anyone can view the report, which is useful if you're working with an external team that needs access to a test report that you've run. So we've shown how we can do a performance test and use the underlying mock service with test data to replace any dependencies. And the last thing I'm going to show is how we can then also test and monitor the API for our application. So we can import our test from all these different types of input. We're going to import a runscope test. So here's our test. We import it into API monitoring. Now what a test is made up of, as you can see here, is a series of steps. So in our case, we need to go to a login page. We actually need to log in and get a token, and then use that token to authenticate the rest of the APIs. So we're going to do a post here with our credentials, get the token for this session and then pass that on to the next step. So this step is the post, where we post our login credentials. As you can see, they're all masked in our vaulting system. And then we're going to do a variable on the response to get a token. And that token is then passed on to the next step, this GET request, where we then post into the header to then get the savings details. All we need to do is to set some initial variables, and the one we need to actually set is the host name, and obviously the address of the system we're going to test, and also the location. So where do we want this test to run from? So we're going to run this test from Hong Kong, California, and Iowa. Now we can set up other parts of the test, so we can trigger webhooks, we can have integrations, we can send emails, but we're going to just run this test. And what you'll see on the left, we've now got 3 tests running. These are the 3 tests in these 3 locations that we've selected. If I drill into one of those tests, you can see we did that initial get. We got back a 200. We then did the post, and we got back our token. And if I look at the next step, we've used that token to then log in. This is the response that came back. Now we could have done assertions on this response to make sure that the actual content of the response was correct. We could also do assertions on the connection details. So you can see here we've got things like the response time. They can be part of our test to ensure that not just that the API is responding, that it's performant, and also the data we're getting back is what we expect for this API call. And if you go back to our dashboard view, what we now see is these are the 3 tests we just ran. If I click run again, you'll see we're now running those 3 tests again. So the orange flashing is the test running, and we can drill into any of those tests, then go and look at that individual test to look at the current status of that running test. So we can use this for testing, but also we can then apply a schedule and perhaps run this test every 5 minutes and use it to monitor. So we can monitor this API in production or in our test and development environments. And like I said, we can then use the notification system to alert should an API start to respond badly. So throughout this demonstration, we've shown you how with BlazeMeter and open source tools, you can build your dependencies with mock services and test data, and then leverage that when you're running your performance, your functional, and your API tests.